Hello, everyone. Well, today is the 6th of August, 2024, and I'm going to continue reading my translation of ERNEST SATOW'S Japanese book collection at Cambridge University Library by Noboru Koyama. If you can, oops, you probably can't see that. The reason I'm going to read this one is because it seems to be the most popular in terms of the number of views. Of most of the videos that I've done lately. It's gone over 100 anyway. So actually, it's not the first book I've translated by Noboru Koyama. Here's the first book, Japanese Students at Cambridge University in the Meiji Era, 1868 to 1912, Pioneers for the Modernization of Japan. And I made it, originally I made it the large size that you can see here, which is actually a US letter size, 8.5 by 11 inches. But recently I've made this smaller and more manageable size, 6 by 9 inches, which is a US trade paperback. And although the print is a little bit small now, I think it's handier in the hand, you know. So do let me know if you think you would be more interested in buying the this book. Well, here's the hardcover version, by the way, same size basically. If you'd be more interested in buying this book as a 6 by 9 inch rather than an 8.5 by 11 inch, please let me know in the comments. I don't get a lot of comments, so I'm often left wondering what people make of my efforts. But anyway, let's get on now, and I've got to find the item I want to share, which is right there. Good. I think you can see that. We finished the foreword last time. We got as far as page 17, and we're going on to the preface. Now, this time I'm using a new computer as well. It's a Microsoft Surface, and also I'm going to use Microsoft Word rather than Adobe, because I found it a little bit jumpy, the Adobe. So here we go. Let's see if we can have it a bit smoother with this. All right, good. So here we go. Preface, Joshō, provenance and the problem of a gap. In English, there is a word provenance, which originates from the French language, provenance. It signifies the changes in the history, pedigree, or lineage, source, and collector of works of art, valuable books, and documents. This book is the story of the manuscript Kohon, titled Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, written by Saito Geshin, and of ERNEST Sato, who acquired the manuscript in Japan. In a broad sense, it is an inquiry into and a greatly expanded discussion of the provenance of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō is an important historical document for researching ukiyo-e, and in particular, the famous but mysterious ukiyo-e print designer Sharaku. It is always quoted in support of the theory that Sharaku was the no actor Saito Jurobe, excuse me, who was in the employ of the Awa Tokushima domain. The British diplomat and Japanologist ERNEST Sato was an outstanding collector of antique Japanese books, Wakan Kosho, and in his collection of Japanese books, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was included. Also, Yura Tetsuji, 1897 to 1979, published Soko Nihon Ukiyo-e Ruikō, Gabundo. Gabundo, 1979. I suppose that's Gabundo. I better check. Might be Gaibundo, but anyway. Which took the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō as its original text, and in the preface, he admirably stated that Geshin had not created a compilation, increased the supplementary notes, added illustrations, and attempted to complete the book, but had caused the handwritten manuscript to be exported overseas as it was, where it came into possession of Cambridge University Library and was preserved there as Ukiyo-e Ruikō. As will be stated in detail in the next chapter, there are many copies of Ukiyo-e Ruikō, but the compiled and edited edition is the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. In fact, between Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, and the leading Japanologist ERNEST SATOW, when looked back on historically, a strange gap, zure, appears. It may be better to speak of a slight discrepancy between them. Expressing the matter figuratively, it may be a kind of misalignment of buttons. I am at a loss to express it accurately in words, but provisionally I will call it a gap. To express this gap in slightly more concrete terms, it first arose between Sato and Sharaku's Nishiki-e, colored woodblock prints, and got wider between Sato and the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. At any rate, there was some kind of gap there. The gap between Sato and Sharaku's Nishiki-e arises from the point that Sato was a former collector of the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, which was indispensable for research into Sharaku, and at the same time was an important collector of Sharaku's Ukiyo-e woodcut prints. Sato appears not to have realized the importance of the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō in his collection when he was collecting Sharaku's Nishiki-e. This was, in a sense, an irony of history. The gap between Sato and the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō lies in the problem of its use or lack of it. In fact, it was buried in his collection, and we may conclude that it was hardly used at all. The consequence of Sato's acquisition of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was that the manuscript was partially included in the research into Japanese art of the collector of artwork William Anderson, 1842 to 1900, a medical doctor. And you've got a couple of footnotes there. I shan't read those. Well, actually, Toshusai Sharaku, that's quite an important footnote, was a Japanese ukiyo-e print designer known for his portraits of kabuki actors. His true name and dates of birth and death are unknown. His active career as a woodblock artist spanned only 10 months, 1794 to 1795. And Yura Tetsuji. Yes, it is Gabundo. Okay. Now, at least the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō did make a great contribution to Anderson's research into Japanese art and art history. It may also be necessary to pay some attention to the way that the knowledge contained in the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō passed via Anderson to other British collectors of ukiyo-e. For example, Edward Fairbrother Strange, 1862 to 1929. Strange collected ukiyo-e at the South Kensington Museum, now called the Victoria and Albert Museum, and wrote and published books with titles like Japanese Illustrations, Nihon no Zuhan, and Japanese woodblock prints, Nihon no Hanga. In 1886, Meiji 19, Anderson published a descriptive and historical catalogue of a collection of Japanese and Chinese paintings in the British Museum in London. And in this, he used Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō as an important work of reference. But after this, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was in a sense buried in Sato's book collection. It was reprinted in 1963, Showa 38, and 1964, Showa 39, in Kinsei Bungei Shiryo Kosho, Documents and Research into Modern Art and Literature, a regularly published periodical magazine, but it was not fully introduced. The main reason for that was that in the mid-1880s, the latter half of the Meiji Tens, Sato almost completely abandoned his Japan research, including that relating to art. In order to build up his career as a British diplomat, he gave up his Japanology. As an expression of his resolve, Sato parted with his extensive Japanese book collection, which he had until then frantically assembled. Among the books he got rid of, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was included. As a result of Sato giving up his Japan research, Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō was buried in his former collection and was hardly used. Sato's disposal of his collection. After Sato finished working in Japan at the end of 1882, from his new diplomatic post at Bangkok in Thailand, Siam, he broke up his collection of antique Japanese books, Wakan Kosho, sending some to Britain and some to Japan, thus disposing of many of them. In this book, this will sometimes be referred to as disposal of Sato's collection, Zōshō Shobun. This is because even items which were first dispersed and kept safely were in the end disposed of, donated. Part of Sato's collection in the disposal of collection was given to the British Museum or close friends and acquaintances such as Basil Hall Chamberlain, 1850 to 1935. He also sent a large number to his friend living in London, Frederick Victor Dickens, 1838 to 1915. Please note the spelling of Dickens, not the same as Charles Dickens with an E. Dickens arranged for them to be stored in a warehouse in London for Sato, who was working overseas as a diplomat. Sato never made further use of the books stored on his behalf by Dickens in London, but by chance, when he was at home on leave, he was able to transfer them to his fellow Japanologist, William George Aston, 1841 to 1911. From this situation, it will be clear that Sato's division and disposal of his collection was part of his larger plan to abandon research about Japan and reflects his strong determination to pursue his career as a diplomat. Excuse me. The phrase disposal of collection includes various nuances. It seems that Sato himself avoided the use of the word disposal. After he had served in Japan 1895 to 1900 and then China 1900 to 1906 as minister and had retired from the diplomatic service, he met with Valentine Shirol, 1852 to 1929, the director of the Foreign Department of the influential Times of London. Sato recorded the following in his diary for January the 29th, 1907, Meiji 40. Shirol says, people declare that I have washed my hands of the Far East and even got rid of my books. I replied that I had certainly not done the latter, though I had given away my Japanese library when I left in 1882. But I did not wish to have anything to do with the China and Japan societies, for if I opened my mouth on Far Eastern affairs, I should get into hot water. Regarding the treatment of Sato's Japanese books, disposal, shobun, can be thought to include donations. Sato himself may not have considered his donations to be a disposal. At least in his diary, Sato does not use the word, but in substance, this can be called a disposal of collection. Even donations to friends can be regarded as a disposal of collection. Sato's disposal of collection was of a large number of books, not a trivial amount. In that situation, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was lost in Sato's former book collection, which was sent to England. In other words, after Sato's collection was broken up and disposed of, it did not receive much attention. It was buried in the huge volume of Sato's former collection. Dickens, who had stored Sato's collection for him in London in 1880, Meiji 13, produced an English translation of Hokusai's Fugaku Hyakkei, 100 Views of Mount Fuji, etc., and presumably had a strong interest in Ukiyo-e and Japanese art, but probably did not venture to inspect his friend's collection in detail. Did he in fact know that in Sato's collection, which he was looking after, the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was included? Perhaps not is the implication there. Sato's colleague in Japanology, W.G. Aston, William George Aston, after he retired from the British Foreign Office, had continued researching into things Japanese at Seaton, a coastal town in the eastern part of the county of Devon. The greater part of Sato's collection, which had been sent to Dickens and stored by him in London, was donated to Aston. It does not seem that Aston, who made use of Sato's former collection in his home at Seaton, paid any more special attention than Sato or Dickens to the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. He probably cast an eye over it, but did not express any particular interest in the description of sharaku contained therein. After Aston's death in 1911, the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, together with the rest of Sato's former collection and Aston's own collection, was added to the collection of Cambridge University Library. Sato disposed of his collection by donating it to friends and the British Museum, but of course he did not let go of all his Japanese books. He kept a few for himself, for example, Edo Meisho Zue, an illustrated guide of famous places in Edo. The work of production of this book was inherited by Saito Geshin from his grandfather and father, and he completed it as a family business, kagyo. It remained in Sato's possession even after the disposal of his collection, as did Hokusai manga, sketches by Hokusai. He probably had several sets of this work, but kept the best one for himself. Sato had a special emotional attachment to Hokusai manga, and he continued to keep them together with his Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, Nishiki-e. Sato may have had a special attachment to the Edo Meisho Zue, which was compiled by the outstanding researcher and writer Saito Geshin. He probably considered it to be an important, that's the footnote referring to my transcription of the diaries. He probably considered it to be an important topographical description of Edo. He must have thought it too precious with its illustrations inserted by Hasegawa Settan, 1778 to 1843, to give away to friends or libraries. Moreover, Sato evaluated Saito Geshin highly as a compiler. He collected almost all of Geshin's published works, hampan, books printed from woodblocks. Of course, he also realized that Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was a work written by Saito Geshin. By the way, the dates of birth and death I've added as a kind of attempt to bring some added value to my translation. They weren't in the original. Sharaku and Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō is always mentioned as a document in connection with Sharaku. One of the main art museums and museums in which Sharaku's works are held is the British Museum. And in fact, the center of the collection there is the Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, Nishiki-e, collected by ERNEST SATOW. The items collected by Sato represent a world-leading collection, and the greatest prints of Sharaku therein have no rival anywhere in the world. There are some scholars of the opinion that the woodblock prints Nishiki-e by Sharaku, collected by Sato, are the British Museum's greatest ukiyo-e collection. It may even be the case that Sato was the greatest collector of Sharaku's work. If that is true, as already indicated, there may be a slight historical irony to be detected in that fact. To show just how important Sato's collection of Sharaku's Nishiki-e is, one example may be given. The exhibition held in November 2019, Reiwa 1, at the Edo Tokyo Museum, titled Special Exhibition 5 Ukiyo-e Favorites, Utamaru, Sharaku, Hokusai, Hiroshige, and Kuniyoshi. For that exhibition, Sharaku's works were loaned from the main museums and art museums abroad and in Japan, and from the collections of individuals amounting to a total of 81 exhibits. Of these, the largest number, 20 items, were from the British Museum, and of those, 16 were items collected by Sato. In particular, it is possible to regard Sharaku's ukiyo-e woodblock print masterpieces as having been borrowed from Sato's collection. However, it is still quite unclear why Ernest Sato was in a position to collect Sharaku's most important works. First, it is not known when Sato collected Sharaku's Nishiki-e. Go back. Yes, he probably collected them in Japan. In the same way that Sharaku himself is a mysterious ukiyo-e master, the circumstances in which Sato collected his works are also unknown. As when solving the mystery of Sharaku himself, if we seek to assume or guess the situation regarding Sato's Sharaku collection, the problem is different depending on whether it was created before or after the disposal of collection. If Sato began collecting Sharaku's work at a time when he was not particularly famous, we can say that Sato's judgment was very discerning, and this is proof that he had a very keen eye. But it may be the case that it was after the disposal of collection. If that were true, it must have been created when Sato was working as minister to Japan, 1895 to 1900. Whoops, I have to go through these footnotes. So, while residing in Japan as the British minister, he secretly collected famous works of Sharaku. By the way, if you want to read the footnotes, please go back and pause your video. Thank you. Or my video. Whose video is it anyway? At the end of chapter 3 of this book, the preface will be quoted of a catalogue prepared by the French art critic Théodore Duret, 1838 to 1927, for the French National Library, recording collected works which he had donated. In that preface, Duret states that Sato began collecting antique Japanese books and woodblock prints on the instructions of Anderson. The time period was the 3 years from when Anderson left Japan in 1880, Meiji 13, until Sato left Japan to return to Britain on leave at the end of 1882, Meiji 15. According to Duret, during that time, Sato was probably collecting ukiyo-e woodblock prints in Japan. So, did Sato collect Nishiki-e by Sharaku at that time? This would seem to have been an ideal time to have collected Sharaku's Nishiki-e. Unfortunately, I don't think I found any diary entries that talked about this. Anyway, we may tentatively conclude that Sato, from the start of 1880 until the end of 1882, at the same time as he was collecting picture books, ehon, and art books, bijutsu-sho, was also collecting ukiyo-e woodblock prints, hanga. This much seems certain, but there was no direct connection in Sato's Japan research between his acquisition of Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō for his research into ukiyo-e and his ukiyo-e collection, including Sharaku's Nishiki-e. At least there are no academic papers or essays, Rombun, which combine these two things, or link them. Sato engaged in research on Japan in various fields, but he never produced any well-summarized research into Nishiki-e in the form of something like an essay. At the end of 1882, of an 1882 essay titled On the Early History of Printing in Japan in the Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, Sato did refer to block printing and pictorial wood engraving, but as regards art, he did not step beyond the field of printing. It may be that Sato was surprisingly cautious about art in the form of ukiyo-e. It seems likely that Sato read Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō together with William Anderson in Japan, or it may be more accurate to state that Sato read and comprehended the text and then explained it to Anderson. It is only in one place in the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, but English has been inserted. It indicates that a copy, sketches or tracings, has been made. This seems to have been written by Sato with a pencil. That's in the front pages of this book. I've already showed it to you in the previous video. However, there is no evidence that Sato, when he made use of the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, paid any special attention to the identity of sharaku, but it is a little difficult to assert this with any finality. There remains a possibility that Sato concentrated on the part of the book in which there were portraits of kabuki actors by sharaku, but he could not capture their true essence and produced deformed versions. He briefly published them, but gave up after 1 or 2 years. It may be that Sato was very interested in this aspect of Sharaku's work and that this had some connection with Sato's collecting of Nishiki-e by Sharaku. And then we got some footnotes again. In later years, in the process of researching the true identity of Sharaku, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō has received a lot of attention. But in fact, this was after Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was reprinted and introduced as a document in an academic periodical in 1964, Showa 39. Although Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō did not contain everything about Sharaku, this was continued in a book which will be introduced later, the Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō by Tatsutaya Shukin. But that Sharaku was none other than the no actor Saito Jurobe of the Awa Tokushima troupe was first written in Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. Then it was reprinted and published in the 1960s, and from that time, researchers into Sharaku began to pay attention to this book. For example, Yura Tetsuji has already been mentioned as the editor of Soko Nihon Ukiyo-e ruikō, 1979, which is a work referred to in the reprint of Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, published in the academic periodical. Furthermore, in Soko Nihon Ukiyo-e ruikō, there is a reprint of part of Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, but Yura Tetsuji supports the theory that Sharaku was Hokusai, so he did not copy the part of Geshin's book containing the theory that Sharaku was Saito Jurobe. As can be seen from the editorial policy of Yura Tetsuji's Soko Nihon Ukiyo-e ruikō, in the several Ukiyo-e ruikō manuscripts, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō has been considered the first and most fundamental text, and it was apparently the basis of the Soko Nihon Ukiyo-e ruikō. Before returning to the topic of Sato's book collection, I should like to point out that, as in the case of Tatsutaya Shukin's Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō has been the source text of several ukiyo-e ruikō. Even if it had been lost in some substantial collections of Japanese books, wakansho, created by foreigners, Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō and the information it contained about Sharaku was to some extent known by people connected with ukiyo-e. The situation is quite complicated and includes some difficult problems. There may not have been many manuscripts which were mere transcriptions of Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, but it seems that the existence of the manuscript of the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō written by Saito Geshin was relatively well known by experts in the field of ukiyo-e and Japanese art. Among overseas researchers also, the title Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was apparently quite well known through the British Museum catalogue edited by Anderson. For example, with regard to Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, the manuscript of Tatsutaya Shukin's Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō has already been mentioned. In the foreword of his Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, the title of the manuscript at the time of publication, Tatsutaya mentions the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. Tatsutaya Shukin borrowed in his Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō from Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō and produced his work based on it. He also added the word Shin, new, to it. But there are certain substantive differences reflected in the difference in title between the manuscript and the published book. Anderson, of course, is William Anderson, who we've met before in the previous video. Tatsutaya Shukin's manuscript title was originally Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō, and it was published in 1889, Meiji 22, as a printed reprint. A printed reprint, gosh. When it was published, the title was changed to Shinzo Ukiyo-e ruikō. The publisher may have wanted to emphasize that this new publication was a further enlarged edition of Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko. As a result, Tatsutaya Shukin's Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko became the first printed and published Ukiyo-e Riko. This printed book, Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko, was circulated not only inside Japan but also overseas. It may be that the publisher assumed from the beginning that the Ukiyo-e Riko would go overseas. In any case, Saito Geshin Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko became known abroad not merely through Anderson's British Museum catalogue, but as a printed book with the title Ukiyo-e Riko, and furthermore through Tatsutaya Shukin's Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko. It's quite a mouthful, isn't it? Also, the description of sharaku, which appeared in Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko, was reproduced almost entirely in Tatsutaya Shukin's Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko. A book was published in Germany in 1910, Meiji 43, in German by Julius Kurt, 1870 to 1949, titled Sharaku, which made use of the printed reprint of Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e Riko and clarified Sharaku's identity. Through Kurt's publication of Sharaku, the ukiyo-e master was fully introduced for the first time, and his name became known throughout the world. The book was also re-imported into Japan, and his fame spread instantly throughout Japan. Sato's collection of Sharaku's works, of course, preceded his being made famous worldwide by Kurt. Sato, Anderson, and. From the 1870s to the first half of the 1880s, Sato was very active in publishing the results of his Japanology, mostly in the Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, founded in 1872. And Sato was one of the founder members, of course. At that time, it can be said that Sato, who was one of the pioneers of Japanology, was a kind of all-rounder in his Japan research. But he did not write or publish any essays on the subject of ukiyo-e. At the end of his essay on the early history of printing in Japan of 1882, Meiji 15, Sato referred to the close connection in Japan between the history of woodblock prints and the printing of books, but he did not go so far as to discuss ukiyo-e woodblock prints, Nishiki-e. It is a pity that he did not touch a little more on the problems of ukiyo-e, etc., in his essays. It may be that Sato's cautious character held him back from entering the field of art proper. Ernest Sato had a plan to write and publish a book about Japanese art together with William Anderson, who was one of the pioneers overseas of research into Japanese art. Anderson resided in Japan in the early Meiji era as an oyatoe gaikokujin, employed foreigner, a medical doctor. At that time, he collected a large number of Japanese artworks. His collection of Japanese art was later absorbed into the British Museum, and it was the start of the museum's collection of Japanese art. But not all of Anderson's collection was taken into the museum. Many pieces were transferred to the collections of friends, such as Ernest Hart. Ironically, Anderson's collection of woodblock prints was transferred into Ernest Hart's collection. William Anderson came to Japan in 1873, Meiji 6, and stayed in Japan for 6 years. Sato came to Japan in 1862, Bunkyu 2, and stayed in Japan after Anderson left, but he went home on leave in 1875, Meiji 8, and was away from Japan for a while. So in fact, the period when Sato and Anderson were able to work together on research of Japanese art was approximately from 1877, Meiji 10, until 1882, Meiji 15, when Sato left Japan. Of course, after that time, Sato met Anderson in London and elsewhere, and it is likely that he continued to support Anderson. As a preeminent collector of Japanese books, he probably helped Anderson to obtain wakansho, books in Japanese and Chinese characters, and documents about art. Ukiyo-e ruikō is the basic text regarding ukiyo-e masters, and from the late Edo period until about the middle of the Meiji period, it was used in manuscript form. The number of manuscripts was, and then we have the footnotes, including one of my papers about Sato's Japanology. The number of manuscripts was very large. Also, including the history of transcription, the classification of manuscripts is very complicated. Ukiyo-e ruikō, Tatsutaya Shukin's Shinzoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, was published in 1889, Meiji 22. Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was in a sense a manuscript compilation of Ukiyo-e ruikō, but the manuscript was not published. Saito Geshin's Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was created as a transcribed book, but the manuscript itself of Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō was never directly published as a woodblock print. It seems likely that the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō remained as a manuscript written in Saito Geshin's own hand and in his possession until his death in 1878, Meiji 11. The story of ERNEST SATOW and the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, which is the central theme of this book, begins at this point. This book investigates the provenance of the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō and seeks to do so by focusing on the relationship between ERNEST SATOW and the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. The central period under investigation, as already mentioned, begins with the Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō coming into Satow's possession after Saito Geshin's death. To be specific, the period of investigation of the provenance will start from the time when the book left the creator Saito Geshin's possession, passing through the collection of the outstanding collector of Japanese books, ERNEST SATOW, until finding its ultimate resting place in the Cambridge University Library. Of course, as prehistory, it is intended to refer in a simple way to the problems connected with the Ukiyo-e ruikō, which was handed down in manuscript form. But as a proportion of the total book, parts relating to ERNEST SATOW, including problems of the collection, constitute a very high percentage. Edmond de Goncourt. Of all the countries of Europe and America, France was the first country where Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, Nishiki-e, became popular. First, it was France where Ukiyo-e provided the opportunity for the fashion of japonaiserie, Japonism, to begin. Of course, the French japonisants, Japanologists, were very interested in Ukiyo-e ruikō, the basic text for ukiyo-e research. The French writer and art critic Edmond de Goncourt, 1822 to 1896, is also famous as a collector of ukiyo-e and other Japanese works of art. And with the cooperation of Hayashi Tadamasa, 1853 to 1906, you'll find both of their photographs or portraits in the front of the book. With the cooperation of Hayashi Tadamasa and others, published Utamaro in 1891, Meiji 24, and Hokusai in 1896, Meiji 29. As can be understood from these publications, Goncourt was an important pioneer of ukiyo-e research. In both Utamaro and Hokusai, Goncourt refers to Ukiyo-e ruikō. As for which manuscript of Ukiyo-e ruikō was used by him, this will be explained in detail in Chapter 1. Yes, folks, we haven't got to Chapter 1 yet. We're still on the preface. It was edited by Ryūtei Tanehiko III, the novelist Takabatake Ransen, 1838 to 1885, and titled Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō, enlarged and revised Ukiyo-e ruikō, the Tanehiko edition. There were two copies of this manuscript, both in the former collection of Hayashi Tadamasa. In the first part of the main text of Utamaro, Goncourt explains Ukiyo-e ruikō in the following way. When he was writing Utamaro, it seems Goncourt made partial use of a translation by Hayashi Tadamasa of Zote Ukiyo-e ruikō, Tanehiko edition, which was in Hayashi Tadamasa's collection. A couple of footnotes there. Edomondo Goncourt is the Japanese pronunciation of Edmond de Goncourt, Utamaro and Hokusai. Ukiyo-e ruikō is the only directory of ukiyo-e school artists, starting with Hishikawa Moronobu, 1618 to 1694. And even though it is still not printed and published, it is an important document which has been communicated to Japanese collectors by transcriptions. Edmond de Goncourt writes here that Ukiyo-e ruikō is unpublished, but Tatsuya Shukin's Shin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō had already been published in 1889, Meiji 22. Regardless of whether it was a manuscript or a published book, Goncourt was clearly aware that Ukiyo-e ruikō was an important work of reference. After Utamaro was published in 1891, whoops, gone too far, Goncourt received a letter dated February 22nd, 1892, Meiji 25, from Dr. Paul Michaud, a Frenchman working at a hospital in Yokohama. In the letter, Michaud offered his support for Goncourt's ukiyo-e research. He told Goncourt that he could assist him because he had a command of Japanese. At that time, Goncourt had already published Utamaro and was planning to publish Hokusai, so he immediately accepted Michaud's proposal and requested that he translate into French the descriptions, etc., of Hokusai in Ukiyo-e ruikō. With the help of a certain Japanese named Urakami or Murakami, Misho translated those parts and offered them to Goncourt. With the Olympics going on in Paris, isn't it nice to be talking about Frenchmen here? Of course, with regard to the translation of Ukiyo-e ruikō from Japanese, Goncourt had until that time relied on the assistance of Hayashi Tadamasa. That was the case when he published Utamaro. Regarding research into Hokusai, the reason why Goncourt asked Misho for a partial translation of Ukiyo-e ruikō lay in a certain degree of estrangement between him and Hayashi Tadamasa at that time. The reason for the chilling of their personal relations lay in a complicated problem regarding the collection of documents about Hokusai. Others, including the Ukiyo-e art dealer Samuel Bing, 1838 to 1905, and Iijima Kyoshin, 1841 to 1901, the author of The Life of Katsushika Hokusai, were involved in that problem. Hayashi Tadamasa was connected with Bing, Kyoshin, and Goncourt. Anyway, in his preparations for writing Hokusai, Goncourt received assistance with the translation from Misho. Goncourt wrote the whole story of Misho and the Ukiyo-e ruikō, first in the Écho de Paris newspaper of June the 7th, 1892, and then published the whole article unedited as the preface to Hokusai in 1896, Meiji 29. This process is described in the preface to Hokusai. Goncourt sent a letter to William Anderson in connection with the publication of Hokusai, and when Hokusai was published in 1896, Meiji 29, he presented a copy of the book to Anderson. Now in the French National Library, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, BNF, in Edmond de Goncourt's papers, there are two letters from Anderson to Goncourt. There's some footnotes there. There are none from Goncourt to Anderson. Of the two letters to Goncourt, one is dated October 29th, 1895, Meiji 28. It is the answer to a letter from Goncourt to Anderson about Hokusai's works held in Britain. The second letter from Anderson is dated February 25th, 1896, Meiji 29, and includes his thanks for the copy of Hokusai. Goncourt sent a letter in the previous year to Anderson dated October 29th, 1895, Meiji 28, but thereafter he seems to have lost Anderson's address, and in a letter to Hayashi Tadamasa dated February 19th, 1896, Meiji 29, he asks for the London addresses of Anderson and Ernest Hart. Goncourt appears to have sent the copy of Hokusai to Anderson as soon as he received his address. In the letter of February 25th, 1896, Meiji 29, Anderson gives an outline of the research into Hokusai conducted by himself, the American archaeologist Edward Sylvester Morse, 1838 to 1925, and the Japanologist Frederick Victor Dickens, 1838 to 1915. In the postscript to this letter, Anderson mentions that he has presented to Goncourt through his friend Ernest Hart, who was probably visiting Paris at the time, a sketchbook of Hokusai, which had been in the possession of the late Baron Leighton, Frederick Leighton, the famous British painter, 1830 to 1896. Anderson also encloses an extract from an essay of his own about his Hokusai research. This was a quotation about Hokusai from a paper published in the Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan in 1878, Meiji 11, titled A History of Japanese Art. Transactions, Volume 7, Part 4, 1879. The Asiatic Society is still going strong, by the way, in Tokyo. In his letter in English to Goncourt of February 25th, 1896, Meiji 29, there is a very interesting point referring to the Ukiyo-e ruikō. In the main text of this letter at the end, Anderson writes as follows: I regret that I did not know sooner that you were engaged upon your important task, as I could have sent you a copy of the Ukiyo-e ruikō, which I have lately transferred to the British Museum. Sir Ernest Sato also has a copy. A simple interpretation of Anderson's letter is as follows. Anderson had recently, probably in 1894, donated or sold a copy of Ukiyo-e ruikō to the British Museum. Apart from this copy, Ernest Sato had one more copy of Ukiyo-e ruikō in his collection. In his letter, Anderson refers to two manuscript copies of Ukiyo-e ruikō. One was used by him, or at least in his collection, and the other was in the collection of Ernest Sato. This is quite baffling for me, and I have difficulty in understanding it. It is surely the case that these two manuscripts of Ukiyo-e ruikō are in fact both of Saito Geshin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō. The two manuscripts, Ukiyo-e ruikō, must be Saito Geshin Zoho Ukiyo-e ruikō, Geshin's personal manuscripts, one being the original and the other being its copy. The manuscript in Sato's collection was the original written by Saito Gesshin, the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, in 3 volumes. This is the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. More footnotes there. This is the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, now in Cambridge University Library. It is the original of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. There is no doubt about this. The problem is in respect of the other copy of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō. It is probably a transcribed copy of the original Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō held at Cambridge University Library. Anderson states in his letter to Goncourt that he has transferred it to the British Museum. In that case, what happened to the Ukiyo-e Ruikō, the copy of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, which Anderson states that he transferred to the British Museum in 1894, Meiji 27? If Anderson really transferred it to the British Museum, it should still be there today. But to my knowledge, it does not exist. This part of the story is an unsolved mystery. Could it perhaps be the case that the item which Anderson says he transferred to the British Museum was not a transcription of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō, but something like an abridged English translation of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō? Did such a simplified version of Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō exist? At any rate, this part of Anderson's letter remains a mystery. It is also a little difficult to understand why Anderson brought up the subject of the Ukiyo-e Ruikō at this point. If we read Goncourt's Utamaro or Hokusai, it is clear that Goncourt consulted the Ukiyo-e Ruikō. So why at this point in time is Anderson regretting that he did not send a copy of Ukiyo-e Ruikō to Goncourt? Of course, it is quite possible that Goncourt had several copies of Ukiyo-e Ruikō. It is also quite easy to understand that Anderson wanted to help Goncourt with his work. Was this why he brought up the topic of Ukiyo-e Ruikō as a kind of symbol of his desire to assist? The reference to the Zoho Ukiyo-e Ruikō in Anderson's letter remains a mystery which this book will not solve. And that is the end of the Joshō, which is the how are we translating that? I've forgotten. Just a minute. I will check. This one is a foreword and one is a preface. Yes, last time I read the Hashigaki, which is the foreword, and this is what I've just read is the Joshō, which is the preface. And so next time I will read chapter 1. But for now, dear friends, I will stop the share and I will say goodbye to you. The book, just to remind you, this book is, whoops, where is the title? There you are. It's on Amazon. You can buy it from Amazon if you are that interested in it. You can get your very own copy, but I'm reading it all anyway, so probably don't need it. All right, cheers now. Bye.